Hi everyone, this is our session on Intro to Game Design by Game Development Society. Uh, the session will be taken by Rudransh Gupta and Prakhar Pratap Man. So Rudransh, you can start.
Yes. So, welcome everyone. After our sessions on game programming, that is the Unity workshop and Intro to Art, we are here with our another session on game design. So, why do we at all need the concept of game design? We know we have programmers, we have artists, but what is the role of game design? That is what we are going to explore today. So, there are three general roles in game development. They are programmers, artists, and designers. Programmers, it is very easy to understand from the name itself that they are the ones who code the who code the mechanics of the games, whereas the artists are the one who create the graphics aspect of the game. And let us see what the designers do. So when people start their journey as a game developer, they usually opt for programming or go up for graphics aspect as artists. The task of the coders is again the mechanics part, coding the mechanics and prototyping the game ideas, whereas the artists decide how the game would look to the players. So finally, what's the task of a designer? One of the major tasks of a designer is to correlate the work of programmers and artists. The decision on what mechanics are used and what art style is supposed to be used by the artist is made by the designer. There are a number of art styles like low poly art, high poly art, 2D art, pixel art. They all are done by the artist. However, they are correlated with the game by a designer. So again, the programmers do the coding, artists make the art assets, and let us see what a designer do, game design. So before coming to the concept of game design, let us first understand what actually a game is. In general terms, we often call anything that creates a sense of fun or recreation a game. But it is not the same case when we define a game from a developer's point of view. From a developer's point of view, we see four aspects to define a game. First one, a goal. A game must have a goal that needs to be achieved while the player moves through the game. Second, there must be an opposition that tries to oppose the player's intentions and make it difficult for the player to reach the goal. Third, there must be a method to overcome the opposition. The player must know what he has to do to overcome that opposition he or she faces. The activity has certain rules which needs to be followed. We have to define rules to make the game understandable to the player. Next. So again, the four major things for something to be called a game are methods, opposition, goals, and rules. Let us understand with an example. We can understand by looking at football. Football, the main goal is to score more goals than the opponent. Again, the opposition again has the same goal to score more goals than you. The method by which it is played is we have to score the goal in the goal post by running and passing the ball across the ground, whereas there are a variety and number of rules that have to be followed. Looking at from a video game perspective, we can take the example of Call of Duty. There, the goal is to score more kills than the other teams or players to win. The opposition again is a team of players who try who oppose our uh, intentions and try to score more points than us. The method here is to kill the members of the opposite team using the guns that are made available to the players. And there are again a number of rules like the player can attack using guns and melee weapons. The bullets must hit the enemy to kill them. The match has a time limit. So basically, all those four aspects are being fulfilled and hence we can call these as games. Finally, coming to game design. Game design is often misinterpreted as art. Art and design are two very different fields. Art is something that defines how the game would look, whereas design is something that makes the whole concept of the game. It combines the mechanics and art, and it drives the whole intended experience to the player and pushes forward the communication and the appeal. So game design is the process of crafting experience. The experiences are centered around players' journey, right? The choices that must be defined to make the concept clear about how the game is going to move forward. The purpose of the game must be carried forward throughout the game. The game design can be subdivided into three major categories: level design, system design, and narrative design. One major thing to make note of is that game design is not about coming up with ideas or coming up with $1 million ideas. Game design is far from just coming with an idea and pitching it out. Game design has to make sure that the mechanic is uh, translated to the audience as well as to the team that is making the game. Next, the role of a game designer: crafting experience. Second, a main role of designer is to make sure that the design of the game gets implemented into the final product. The idea that was first thought behind the game must reach to the audience while the game is published. A designer has to collaborate with the programmers and artists such that everyone is on the same page. So programmers and artists do two very different tasks. Correlating them into one is the most important task for a designer. Communication is one of the most necessary skills that a designer needs to possess. Again, the process of game making comes through these stages. First, we have an original design that is carried forth to the next step by a designer and made available to the programmer and artist so that they can start working on them. Like programmer can start their code part and artist can start their modeling part. Again, game design has a subdivision that is called level design. Level design is the role of level design is layout the interactions the player will experience in a game. Levels are a part of game. Generally, games are divided into levels. There are many games that are infinite running games. However, they again have some parts that can be called as levels. A level designer has to work upon map design, events, player interaction, as well as world building, like setting up objects in the scene, or how it would place the characters, enemies. All that comes under level design. From a development standpoint, level design involves the layout portion of the development cycle. A level designer creates challenges for the player and provides them with tools to overcome such challenges. So the design has a number of topics that can be discussed. So we can come up with the first one, that is narrative. The game design has to have a perfect storyline, a set pattern, values, various clues or hints that are needed to be translated to the audience. Designers are expected to come up with a story, and narrative design is thus a dedicated field. The events in a game can be divided into three general subcategories: explicit events, implicit events, and emergent events. Next. Next, we have implicit events. So while we play the games, there are several events that are not stated, but they become obvious while we play the game. Like if we have to complete a mission, we have to do some task that is not stated to us, but that becomes obvious while we play. Like For an example, we can say that an area with a trail of blood that leads to a dead body is an example of an implicit event. Next up, we have explicit events. These are made obvious and are stated while we work. They are stated directly to the player. Like in Vice City, we have missions. Those missions are made clear to the player that they have to follow those missions to move forward in the game. So that is a task of explicit events. These are the easiest to show, but the laziest as well. Emergent events. Again, when you have played games, there are events that emerge out of nowhere and they are not coded, but they happen naturally. Players interact with the game world and they happen naturally. For example, saving an NPC character, a non-player character, who later comes to help you. You would have seen this in Vice City as well, I guess. Yeah, next up is goals. No game is complete without a goal, so we must have goals in that games. So in a game, each level must reach to an endpoint or a goal that a player has to achieve. This goal informs all the decisions that the player will make. All the player interactions will in some way contribute to our main goal. Player must not be made to feel powerless or bored in any process. They must have goals, small goals, while they go forth in the game. The goals in a level needs to be conveyed to a player. This can be combined with a navigation section that is driving the player towards the goal, or the environment again can hint or provide hints or clues so that the player can move forward and complete those goals. A good level tells the player what is the goal, but doesn't tell them how to achieve it. So it is generally not made obvious to the player. So it would become mundane for the player to do all those things that are just being stated to it again and again. However, they are hints and clues that the player goes through and understands while playing the game. The level provides tools to the player to achieve their goals. Next up, we have objectives. Uh, to reach the final objectives, there must be smaller objectives that are needed to be made in the process. Like in GTA games, we have missions, various missions we have to complete while we reach at the final thing. Completing an objective provides a new objective. All missions are generally connected. So that's how we define the goal process. Next up, we also have these parallel missions. Uh, in games with predefined end goals, there may be a number of smaller objectives that need to be completed before the final goal. These objectives can be completed in any order. Specifying the logical order of the games is important. Events must behave in that logical order. Sound design is also a part of something like this that can play a major role in defining this idea. The completion of one will lead to another objective or help in completing the other objectives. Next up, we have progression, and Prakhar will take over from here.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone. I am Prakhar and let's quickly pick up from where Rudransh left. Rudransh just told you about goals in game, that you need to have a proper setup of goal so that the player does not feel lost on what to do and how to do it. And as important is having the proper final goal in a game, equally important is having proper progression towards that goal, right? So what I mean by that is, suppose you have a game where you have a final goal, and to reach that goal, you haven't set up a proper level. Like the whole of the game, almost all of the game is doing mundane tasks like going from one place to another, and then you have the final goal or final task which is at the end. So all the action or all the actual gameplay of the game is centered at the end of the game, and this is not a proper or good way to design games, right? So progression is a very important aspect which needs to be taken care of, and we'll talk about it now. Next slide. So the the way a game is structured is really important. Whenever a game is made, there are certain events which is happening at every point in the gameplay. We call them events. So one after other events are placed in a game, and we go through those events to reach the final goal. Example would be campaign missions in Call of Duty. So if any of you have played Call of Duty campaign missions, you know that what happens is you play the game and a wave of enemy comes, you defeat that wave of enemies, then next wave of enemy comes, and so on. The level progresses, and it might get progressively harder to play as more enemies come, or quicker enemies, or better aiming enemies come. But this is the general structure. So what happens through this is that we learn from it. So initially we are given easy levels where it is easy to kill enemies, and from there we basically recognize certain patterns, like these enemy do behave like this, and these type of enemies behave like this. These are the intervals in which these shoot, and then we recognize patterns from there, right? So once we have recognized those patterns, what now will happen if the game gives us a harder level, we will know how to actually play the game, and using our skills we would be able to defeat those enemies, right? So all of the levels, or any good game which is built, they are based on some form of pattern or theme which they use, so that player does not feel totally at loss on what to do, or does not feel powerless on how to progress in the level, right? So generally good games follow a structure called the learn, play, challenge, surprise loop, right? So what happens in learn, play, challenge, surprise loop is initially you give them very easy levels, or easy gameplay, where you basically teach them on how to use the game mechanic which you have implemented. So there would be very low health enemies that are coming, for example, and you can easily shoot at them to show that how to shoot and stuff like that. So basically you are initially teaching the player on how to play, then you give them actual gameplay, which is called the play phase of the loop. So there the player can actually put their skills to use, and in fact increase their skills by practicing there, right? And in the end you can give them a challenge phase, where there are generally boss levels you might have seen, or there are larger, bigger, or quicker, or faster enemies. So there they get to actually put to use the skills they have learned in the previous phases. So after completing the challenge phase, they feel a sense of accomplishment, which we want, so that the game is overall satisfying, right? And to add an extra bit of richness to your game, you can add a surprise loop. And what happens, surprise phase. So what happens in a surprise phase is you subvert the player's pattern recognition, right? So for example, generally what happens is enemy attacks, and suppose there's a game in which enemy attacks and you are able to block it, right? But you can also give them, in the end you can also give an enemy whose attacks you are to block. So then what the player would have to do is innovate some other way, for example dodging the attacks, or reflecting them off, or something like that. So what this happens when this happens, then the player is forced to recognize not recognize, innovate a new way to defeat that enemy. And when he's able to do that, that gives them an extra amount of satisfaction, right? And that's what we want in our games. We want our games to be satisfying. We want our games to be liked by people, right? So generally this loop is employed to make decently paced plays decently paced progressions in our levels and game design. Okay, next slide. So yeah, so the loop which I just talked about, the learn, play, challenge, and surprise loop, a part of that is reinforcement. Whenever we give them the learn or play phase, that is called reinforcement. What this means is you focus on the game mechanic, and you give the player time to learn that core game mechanic and build up skills in that. For a great example would be Mario. Everyone must have played Mario. So the core mechanic of that game is jumping, right? So the most of the level is based on that core mechanic, that you have different platforms or different combination of platforms in different arrangements, and different levels of skill set is required to jump from one platform to another, in some timing is required, etc. Right. So what that is basically doing is reinforcing your skills in that core game mechanic. So the bulk of the level should be based on this reinforcement part of the game, right? So what this does is it forces the player to constantly get better with the theme or the core mechanic of the level, right? And why this is done is so that when the player actually faces a difficult level, he has the required skill set to be able to complete the challenge, right? So next slide. Yeah. So after you have done your reinforcement part, another part is subversion. This is where the surprise part comes, right? So now the player has the skill. Now he's able to defeat harder enemies, right? So to add an extra layer of richness to your game, what you do is you subvert the player's expectations. For example, in this GIF, you can see that suppose you have played through few levels, you have gained certain weapons, and you are able to use it very skillfully. But there's a plot twist now that the main boss snatches away all your weapons. So now you cannot use those skills which you learned so far. So now you have to innovate and think of new ways to kill your enemy. So that could be like you might notice uh, that the boss enemy, whenever he attacks, there is a certain place from where the attack reflects off and hits himself. So you might notice that and you try to make him attack on that certain place and kill the enemy by his own attacks, right? So this could be the innovation that you find, right? So this would be called subversion. When this happens, the player is forced to innovate and think of new ways to play the game. And when that is the player generally feels smart and appreciates the game. So this would be also a good way to handle progression along the level in game design, right? Next slide. Yeah. So predictability is also closely related to subversion. Okay. So there needs to be a very delicate balance between predictability and non-predictability in a game, because you cannot make a game that is totally predictable, right? Because at every point the player would know what would happen next. What do I need? Which key do I need to press to be able to dodge this enemy, or to be able to kill that enemy, or to go from where to where? And when that happens, that every move is predictable and the player at every point knows what to do, then the game becomes mundane. The game becomes boring, right? So you cannot make a game which is totally predictable. But on the other hand, you can also not make a game which is totally non-predictable, right? You cannot make a game where when you press a key button, something happens, and when you press that same key button at some other point, something else happened, right? You cannot make the game totally unpredictable because the player won't even play it because he's not able to do what he wants, right? Because anything is happening in that game. So you cannot make totally unpredictable games. So there needs to be a certain type of balance about predictability, right? So pacing your levels is really important, and generally a roller coaster model is employed. That there's a high peak where you make the game unpredictable, and there are certain surge of enemies or something like that, where the player has to use his innovations or skills to be able to overcome that. And then there is a certain level of button smashing, you can say, that there are just enemies you need to get clear of, or you have to do certain mundane tasks. So if there's a roller coaster model employed in your key, that makes it look more neat or better. So when this happens, to make your game non-predictable, or at least at certain points you need to make your game unpredictable, right? So to do that, you can employ subversion, which we just talked about in the previous slides, right? Next slide. Yeah. So once we have handled predictability, an important factor which is generally overlooked by game designers is player convenience. Like, we have taken care of the goal which we are employing in our game. the progression of how a level progresses. We have taken care of whether our game is predictable or not, whether it's fun to play, whether it's new to the player at every stage, right? But what happens is sometimes the games, even after having all these elements, are not fun to play. And why is that? That is because it is not convenient for the player. And what I mean by that is, for example, assume there's a game and you are totally immersed in that game. You like that game very much. But the problem with that game is, in order to check your health every time, you need to go to the main menu so that the health meter or health stats is shown. And that is very inconvenient for the player, because every time he needs to check his health, he has to go back into the main menu, which is generally not desired, because it's taking you out from that immersiveness of that game. And that is what we refer to as player inconvenience, right? Another example would be Red Dead Redemption 2. I hope some of you must have played this game. And what happens in that is, it's a really beautiful game and it has a lot of realism to it, right? And but the problem is, when you want to travel from one place to another, what you can do is you can either walk from one place to another, or you can take an horse. But since the game is what happens is, after you run a certain distance, the player gets tired and starts to slow down. And the same thing happens with the horse. And that becomes irritating, especially if you are to travel long distances, right? So in an attempt to achieve realism, what they have done is added player inconvenience in that game, which is generally not a good idea, right? So good levels, uh, whatever level you are making or whatever game you are designing, at every point of that game, there needs to be a sense of accomplishment for the player, right? If you take half an hour for going from one place to another, then that's not giving the player a sense of accomplishment. It's just boring tasks. So that would not be included in a good level design or good game design, right? So what we generally as game designer do is try to minimize the player inconvenience as much as possible, right? So yeah, so generally include mundane tasks, which I just talked about. You have to travel from one place to another, and it's boring because you are too slow or something like that. And also, other than that, there are sometimes optional objectives or some tasks that you need to do in order to be able to, increase your stats. Suppose there's a boss which has a significantly higher level than yours. So to be able to fight him, you need to increase level. And how do you do that? By gaining XP. So you do random mundane tasks, you do smaller side missions, and that becomes mundane sometimes, and they are not fun to play. So, and other than that, player freedom is also an important aspect where the player might feel inconvenient. Players expect some degree of freedom during their gameplay. Forcing players to complete boring tasks um, is a level is a sort of inconvenience. For example, suppose you are making a open world game, but in that game you are forcing the player to follow a specific path that you want the player to take. That becomes inconvenient, because since it's an open world game, the player would naturally want to explore other pathways to approach the same level, right? It would want to take a stroll. It would want to take a different pathway to that same spot. If you're not allowing that, that becomes inconvenient for the player, and that looks bad on your game. Other than that, there are some games which employ you know um, content restrictions, that you won't be able to um, use this type of weapon or this type of armor once you have this specific number of these items. You can do it to a certain level, but overdoing it might spoil the experience for the player as well, right? Suppose there's a basic armor which has very high price, so you have to work very hard to get that armor, which is again inconvenient for the player, because it's boring, because you are doing the same things to earn money for that armor. So we generally want to avoid that. Next slide. Yeah. So again, coming back to that long walk thing, that was there in Red Dead Redemption 2, that it's boring to walk from one place to another. And how do we solve this problem? An easy way, but not generally good way to solve this problem would be fast travel. You must have seen this in certain games like Horizon Zero Dawn or Assassin's Creed games. I'm not sure about Red Dead Redemption 2, but I think it's there. But the problem with this is it's, yeah, Witcher 3 as well, right? So fast travel is a pretty easy thought to fix this inconvenience, right? Because you are taking away that time which was being wasted in traveling from one to another. But again, it raises one other problem which I just talked about in previous slide, and that is immersiveness, right? When if you need to fast travel, you need to get out of the out of the gameplay into the menu, and then you can fast travel from one point to another in the map, which is somehow degrading the experience of the game because it's not as immersive as it could be. So if it's a easy idea, but not a very good idea. And what could be a better idea in this? And it could you could make the maps smaller so that it does not take that much amount of time. You could add interesting landscape so that a player is encouraged to go through that full journey and experience the game, right? Or you can add shortcuts or alternate pathways which the player can take to reach there quickly. So these are some better ways to overcome the problem of the long walk, right? Similarly, if there are other inconveniences, you can think of other smart solutions to make your game design, and this is what generally a game designer does, right? So next slide, we'll take a look at the next point, which is difficulty. Okay, so now that we have talked about how a level will progress and how we will set up the final goal or how we will minimize player inconveniences, we need to take care of the difficulty level of that game as well. Because if you make the game too easy, it would get boring very quickly. And if you make the game very hard, then no one would be able to get past even the first level, and then they would drop it and won't play your game. We don't want that. So what can we really do? So generally what games do is, this is again a bad idea, but most of the games which you see nowadays employ this, which is they let you choose the difficulty level which you want in the beginning itself, right? It would be an option called easy, then there would be medium, then hard. And this is generally a bad idea. And why is that? Because the player hasn't even played the game yet. How would he know that if he would do well on hard or if he would be bored on easy, right? So this is generally a bad idea. And in recent times, the games have started to change it up a little bit. And if you have played Horizon Zero Dawn, it gives us more options. Like if you want to focus on only the story, it would give you, weaker enemies, and it would focus more on the story. And if you want a balanced experience of story and gameplay and combat, you can choose that. And if you want only combat and you are not interested in story that much, and you can choose that option, and then the enemies would be significantly harder and it would test your skills, right? So that is slightly better way to approach this problem of difficulty, right? But there are other ways to approach this as well, which we'll see now. Next slide. So the better way to approach this would be to let the player choose their own difficulty. And how we can implement that is by choosing a risk versus reward format. What this means is, in the same level, you can approach your, what do I call it, objective in multiple ways. First would be an easy way, and it does not require that much skill, but in the end, you aren't rewarded as much, right? And then there would be a difficult way or multiple, you need to keep in mind multiple things which need to be taken care of. And then if you do that, completing those criteria as well, you are rewarded more. So the player here is free to choose at every point how much difficulty he wants to take, how much risks he want to take, and how much he would be rewarded for that, right? So when this happens, the player does not feel cheated that I am not able to play this game because it's too hard or this is too boring for me. Because if you are bored, pick up the harder thing so that you are rewarded more, right? So this risk versus reward format generally works very well uh, in handling this difficulty situation. Okay, so next slide, please. Yeah, so difficulty is chosen based on how the player plays as a game. And if there is a way to solve a problem, there could be multiple ways to solve a problem, and each one has its own perks. You can approach a same problem in different ways. You can, if you have played Assassin's Creed, to give an example, if you have played Assassin's Creed, you can, what happens in Assassin's Creed is generally you have to assassinate a person, right? So you could either just, barge in that location, kill that person and run away from there. That would be the easy way. But there are also optional objectives in that game. Yeah, hitman as well. So there are also optional objectives, like you cannot be seen by any other guards, or you are not, if you raise the alarm, then you don't have to raise the alarm basically, or you have to kill them from above, you have to use arrow or something like that. So when these factors come in, the game becomes harder. But in that, it's more rewarding. It actually tests your stealth skills, right? It actually tests your skills. So if a person only wants to enjoy the story, he would go by the easy method and do what he needs to do, complete the mission. But if there's a person who is interested in the gameplay part or the game mechanic part, then he is free to do that, and he would be accordingly rewarded, right? If you have played Horizon Zero Dawn, you can approach the same problem in basically four different ways. You can set up traps to, catch the robots, or you can directly barge with them. You can directly fight with them, confront them directly, or use other robots to fight the other robots. So there are multiple ways to approach a problem. And when you give the player that choice, this problem of difficulty and it being boring or too difficult, that vanishes very quickly. So this is what you can do when designing your own game, right? Next slide. Yeah, and this is what I just talked about, optional paths. You can choose many other things that you need to do. You can set up traps, for example. uh, that's what this basically says. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so now that we have talked about the difficulty, mechanics is also an important aspect. I won't say also, I would say it's the most important aspect of game design. And why is that? Is because what makes or breaks your game is the game mechanic. If you don't have an interesting game mechanic, your game is generally not going to do well. Okay, and if it is an interesting game mechanic, it would do well, given that you employ it correctly. Okay, so that's what we are going to talk about now. Um, uh, the experience for a gameplay is basically defined for a player. The experience for a player is basically defined through its gameplay, right? So whatever mechanic you choose to employ in your game, if you don't use it to its fullest, then it won't be as good a experience for the player, right? So whatever mechanic you choose, firstly, if the mechanic is something unique, something fresh, something that the player hasn't experienced before, then that's an extra plus, right? The player would the player is going to be impressed by that. And even if it's not something new, if you utilize that mechanic to its fullest and bring innovation in that mechanic, that is a plus as well. The way a player interacts in the game is through game mechanics, and you can use certain number of clever tricks, or use the mechanic in many innovative ways to make the game interesting, right? So next slide. An example of mechanic focused design would be Super Mario again, right? So the only main thing you do in Mario is jump, right? But that jump mechanic is so refined, so polished, that even today I love to play Mario. Many of us, many of you might as well love to play Mario. And why is that? Because it uses that jump in very innovative ways, right? Because you can jump on platforms from here to here where timing matters. You can break walls. You can even jump on enemies, right? So that makes that game mechanic very interesting, and that's what makes the game so popular and good, right? And once you have a clear game mechanic, you find other game around. What that is, if you ever played Mario, even if you aren't doing anything, just jumping in that game gives a certain amount of joy, right? Why is that? And that is because the sound design, the animation, the snappiness of that uh, jump, that is so well refined that it feels nice to play, right? So you need to generally focus on your mechanics, right? And other than that, you need to employ it in ways, certain ways, that so that the player has to innovate. If it's a simple shooting mechanic, for example, that you have to just shoot people or any enemy that you're encountering, then it would quickly get boring because you're just shooting people again and again all throughout the level. Suppose you have 30 hours of gameplay, 30 hours of gameplay, you're just shooting people, and that is boring. So what do? You add certain elements. Suppose um, you add a canister of oil which catches fire on being hit by a bullet. Suppose you add explosive, you add people on board so that it drowns when the ship is damaged. So you can add innovation like this, and that generally makes what makes a good game, right? Next slide. Yeah, so these were the important aspects which you need to take care of when you are designing a game, and these are the all things which a game designer generally needs to keep in mind while designing games, right? And if you get all of this right, you will generally end up making a really good game which everyone would want to play, right? And I hope this session gave you some insight on what the role of a game designer is and how you can be a better game designer, right? And if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat or unmute and ask yourselves. And I hope you had a fun session. Thank you. And